Maya Ellison was never one to flinch. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd learned early that the world didn't always bend toward fairness. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, in a modest duplex off Peachtree Street, Maya grew up under the watchful eye of her father, Samuel Ellison, a civil rights lawyer who'd spent decades challenging the city's entrenched biases. Samuel was a towering figure, not in stature but in presence, his salt and pepper hair framing a face etched with the kind of resolve that made judges pause mid-sentence. He'd raised Maya alone after her mother passed when she was 6, teaching her to navigate a world that often saw her skin before her soul. As a teenager, Maya had faced her own battles. At 16, she'd been stopped by police while walking home from school, her backpack searched for no reason other than an officer's hunch. The humiliation of standing on a public sidewalk, her books scattered, while neighbors peeked through curtains, burned into her memory. Samuel didn't just comfort her, he taught her to channel that pain into purpose. "They'll try to make you small," he'd said, his voice steady as he handed her a law book. "But you decide how tall you stand." Those words became her anchor, guiding her through a law degree she pursued not for prestige but for justice. She declined honors at graduation, choosing instead to work in the shadows of small human rights organizations, eventually becoming a federal supervisory agent tasked with monitoring judicial misconduct, a role she kept secret, even from her closest allies. On a humid June morning in 2025, Maya parked her black Mercedes outside the Fulton County Courthouse, the car's sleek surface reflecting the cracked pavement. She was there to observe a routine hearing, her silver emblem, a federal badge shaped like an eye with 3 concentric circles, tucked discreetly under her jacket collar. Her mission was simple: gather evidence of systemic bias in the court's proceedings. But as she stepped out, adjusting her crisp white blouse, she felt the weight of eyes on her, not the curious glances of passers-by, but the sharp, scrutinizing stare of someone who saw her as out of place. Officer Daniel Reed, 45, approached with a swagger that came from years of unchecked authority. His family's name was a fixture in Atlanta's law enforcement, his father a retired captain who'd shielded Daniel's career from scrutiny. Daniel's blue eyes scanned Maya's car, lingering on the special issue license plate and parking permit, his lips curling into a sneer. "Nice car," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Borrow it from your boss?" The words hit like a slap, but Maya's face remained steady, her brown eyes meeting his without a flicker of fear. She'd heard worse, felt worse, and learned long ago that reacting gave men like Reed the power they craved. She opened her car door, retrieved a folded permit from her wallet, and handed it to him. "It's valid," she said, her tone even, professional. The permit was pristine, with a QR code confirming her right to park. But Reed didn't scan it. He glanced at it, then tore it in half, letting one piece fall to the ground. His boot crushed it into the pavement, the act deliberate, his gaze locked on hers. "You don't belong here," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and cold. "Kneel, and maybe I'll let you walk away." Maya's heart thudded, not from fear but from the familiar sting of injustice. She thought of her father, who'd once stood before a judge in this same courthouse, forcing a ruling to be overturned because it violated fairness. She thought of the 16-year-old girl she'd been, humiliated on a sidewalk. Her hand tightened around her wallet, but her shoulders stayed square. She wouldn't give Reed the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she adjusted her jacket, the silver emblem catching a glint of sunlight, and stepped toward the courthouse doors, her heels clicking with purpose. She wasn't just walking into a building, she was walking into a fight she'd been preparing for her entire life. The Fulton County Courthouse loomed like a fortress, its marble columns casting long shadows across the lobby. Maya Ellison stepped inside, her heels echoing on the polished floor, each step a quiet defiance against the weight of Officer Daniel Reed's words still lingering in her ears. She was here to observe, to document, but the air felt charged, as if the building itself knew she was more than a bystander. Her silver emblem, hidden beneath her collar, pressed against her skin, a reminder of her mission and her father's legacy. Inside courtroom number 3, Judge Robert Callahan presided from a bench that seemed to elevate him above humanity. At 60, Callahan was a relic of Atlanta's old guard, his career built on maintaining order over seeking justice. Decades ago, as a young judge, he'd been humbled by Samuel Ellison, Maya's father, who'd exposed his mishandling of a witness protection case. The memory still stung, buried beneath years of rulings that favored compliance over fairness. Callahan's gray eyes scanned the room, settling on Maya as she entered, unannounced, unlisted on any docket. The courtroom was sparse, with only a handful of spectators, a mix of clerks, reporters, and curious locals. Emily Harris, the 38-year-old chief clerk, sat at her station, her fingers hovering over a keyboard. Emily had climbed the ranks by keeping her head down, falsifying records when ordered, a habit born from her early years as a single mother desperate to secure her job. Her loyalty to Callahan was less about respect and more about survival, a choice she justified to quiet her conscience. "Step forward," Callahan's voice boomed, cold and authoritative, though Maya's name wasn't on any list. She moved to the witness stand, her posture straight, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. The room felt smaller, the air thick with expectation. "Courtroom disruptor, Maya Ellison," the speaker crackled, a pre-recorded label that stunned the clerk, who hadn't entered it. Maya's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing, her silence a shield honed by years of facing systems designed to break her. "You've been summoned to answer for your conduct," Callahan continued, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, avoiding her eyes. "Your behavior incriminates you." The words were vague, baseless, yet delivered with the weight of a verdict. Maya's mind flashed to her father's lessons: "They'll use the law as a weapon if you let them." She stood firm, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her white blouse pristine despite the morning's ordeal. Officer Reed, stationed near the stand, leaned in, his hand brushing her shoulder, not a grip, but a warning. "Kneel," he whispered, echoing his earlier demand outside. Maya's pulse quickened, not from fear but from the clarity of her purpose. She thought of the 16-year-old girl stopped on the sidewalk, of her father's late-night talks about fighting without raising a fist. Slowly, she lowered herself to her knees, but her back remained unbowed, her eyes locked on Callahan's bench. The room stilled, the spectators' breaths catching as her silence filled the space like a storm gathering strength. Emily Harris's fingers trembled over her keyboard, typing "Defendant, Maya Ellison," despite no official record. She knew this was wrong, her own past, bending to authority to keep her job, haunted her now. A young journalist, Sarah Nguyen, sat in the gallery, her pen frozen mid-note. Sarah, 28, had grown up in a Vietnamese-American community where police scrutiny was a constant shadow. She recognized the trap Maya was in, her own memories of being questioned for looking suspicious, urging her to act. Yet, like the others, she hesitated, the weight of the system's authority pressing against her courage. Callahan leaned forward, his voice sharp. "If you won't apologize, kneel to show submission." The command was a test, not of guilt but of power. Maya's eyes flickered, not with defeat but with resolve. She adjusted her collar, the silver emblem catching a stray beam of light, unnoticed by most but a signal to herself. She was no ordinary defendant. Her training as a federal agent, her years of covert work, had prepared her for this moment. She knelt, not to submit, but to expose the system's need to dominate. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was a mirror, reflecting the courtroom's shame back at its architects. Maya Ellison's knees pressed against the cold tile of courtroom number 3, but her spine remained a straight line, unyielding as the oak benches around her. The Fulton County Courthouse, with its heavy air of authority, seemed to shrink under her gaze. She wasn't just a woman kneeling, she was a force, her silence louder than any protest. Judge Robert Callahan's command to kneel had been meant to break her, but instead, it cracked the facade of his control. The spectators, a mix of clerks and locals, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Maya and the judge, sensing a shift they couldn't name. Maya's thoughts drifted to her father, Samuel, who'd once stood in this same courthouse, his voice dismantling a corrupt ruling with nothing but truth and persistence. She remembered the nights he'd come home exhausted, his briefcase heavy with case files, yet he'd still sit with her, explaining how silence could be a weapon if wielded right. "It's not about staying quiet," he'd said, his eyes warm but fierce. "It's about making them hear what you don't say." That lesson anchored her now, her heart steady despite the weight of Officer Daniel Reed's hand lingering near her shoulder. Reed, standing just behind her, felt the shift too. His career, propped up by his family's influence, had never faced real scrutiny. But Maya's unflinching eyes stirred a memory, a time he'd been reprimanded early in his career for roughing up a young black man, only for his father to bury the complaint. The unease creeping up his spine wasn't guilt, but the dawning realization that this moment might not be swept away so easily. He adjusted his stance, his hand twitching, unsure whether to press harder or retreat. In the clerk's booth, Emily Harris typed frantically, her screen flashing errors. "Defendant, Maya Ellison, no record found," it read, a glitch that mirrored her own fractured conscience. Years ago, she'd falsified a report to secure her job, a choice that let her feed her daughter but left a stain she couldn't wash out. Now, watching Maya kneel without bowing, Emily felt that stain spread, her fingers hesitating over the keys as she questioned her role in this charade. Maya's fingers brushed the edge of her jacket collar, where the silver emblem, an eye with 3 concentric circles, lay hidden. It was more than a badge, it was her father's legacy, a symbol of her role as a federal supervisory agent. She'd spent years in the shadows, documenting judicial misconduct, her identity cloaked to protect her mission. Now, with a subtle press of her fingertip, she activated a microtransmitter tucked into the emblem. A faint vibration confirmed the signal. The hearing was now streaming to a secure federal feed, every word and gesture recorded for a reckoning beyond this room. Sarah Nguyen, the young journalist in the gallery, noticed the glint of silver under Maya's collar. Her own past, growing up in a community where police stops were routine, made her hyper-aware of subtle signs. She clutched her notebook, her heart racing as she pieced together the anomaly. Maya wasn't a defendant, she was something else entirely. Sarah's instinct screamed to record, but fear of retaliation held her back. She thought of her mother, who'd once told her, "You don't fight power by shouting, you watch, and you wait for the right moment." This was that moment, but Sarah's pen stayed still, her courage wavering. Callahan's voice cut through the silence, sharp but unsteady. "Write your apology," he ordered, as a legal assistant handed Maya a blank sheet and pen. The projector above flashed a scripted confession, "I apologize for disrupting this court." Maya's lips curved slightly, not a smile, but an acknowledgement of the trap's transparency. She took the pen, her movements deliberate, and wrote a single line, "I do not apologize for doing nothing wrong." The words, simple and unyielding, landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room. Emily's screen flickered as she received the scanned copy of Maya's note. Her breath caught, not from surprise but from the clarity of Maya's defiance. She thought of her daughter, now 12, and the lies she'd told herself to justify her compliance. Sarah, in the gallery, scribbled the sentence in her notebook, her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that she was witnessing a moment that could redefine justice. The room held its breath, the silence no longer Callahan's weapon but Maya's, a mirror reflecting the system's fragility back at itself. The courtroom's silence was a living thing, heavy and taut, as Maya Ellison knelt at the center of Fulton County Courthouse's number 3. Her handwritten note, "I do not apologize for doing nothing wrong," lay on the judge's bench, a quiet indictment that seemed to burn under Judge Robert Callahan's gaze. He sat rigid, his fingers twitching near his gavel, the weight of his 60 years in the system crumbling under the scrutiny of a single pair of eyes. Maya's eyes, steady and unyielding, held no anger, only the clarity of someone who'd seen this script before and refused to play her part. Officer Daniel Reed stood frozen, his hand no longer on Maya's shoulder but hovering, as if unsure whether to act or retreat. His career had been a series of power plays, each incident buried by his father's influence. But now, the memory of a young man he'd roughed up years ago, his cries ignored, his complaint erased, resurfaced, making Reed's chest tighten. He glanced at Callahan, seeking a signal, but the judge's face was a mask of unease, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. In the clerk's booth, Emily Harris stared at her monitor, where the red text, "Access Restricted, Federal Oversight," blinked ominously. Her past choices, falsifying records to keep her job, to ensure her daughter's stability, felt like chains now. She remembered the first time she'd altered a transcript, her hands shaking as she justified it as, just this once. Now, facing Maya's defiance, Emily's hands trembled again, not from fear but from the dawning realization that her silence had built this moment as much as Callahan's orders. Maya's subtle movement, a slight tilt of her head, went unnoticed by most, but not by Sarah Nguyen, the journalist in the gallery. Sarah's own history of being profiled in her youth made her hypervigilant, and she caught the faint glint of Maya's silver emblem. Her heart pounded as she realized what it meant. Maya was no ordinary defendant. The emblem, an eye with 3 concentric circles, was a federal marker, one Sarah had seen in her research on covert operations. Maya was recording this, exposing it. Sarah's pen moved furiously, capturing every detail, her fear giving way to a resolve to bear witness. The courtroom's overhead projector flared to life, unprompted, displaying a live feed of the hearing. Gasps rippled through the spectators as the judge's earlier words echoed, "If she won't apologize, let her kneel." The audio, captured by Maya's hidden device, was raw, unfiltered, its contempt undeniable. Callahan's face paled, his jaw twitching as he realized the room was no longer his. The feed was streaming to a federal server, and from there, to public platforms, the viewer count climbing, 50,000, 100,000, 500,000 in minutes. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications as the stream went viral. She thought of her mother, who'd taught her to document injustice quietly, to wait for the moment when truth could no longer be ignored. This was that moment. She opened her social media, posting a clip of the feed with a caption, "This is not justice. This is power." Her post exploded, shared by thousands, including those who'd faced similar humiliations and found in Maya's silence a voice for their own pain. Maya rose from her knees, her movement fluid, deliberate, as if the act of kneeling had been her choice, not their command. She faced Callahan, her voice low but piercing. "You worked under my father, Samuel Ellison, 20 years ago," she said, each word a chisel against the judge's composure. "He forced you to revise a ruling because you broke the law. You haven't forgotten, have you?" The room stilled, the weight of her father's legacy, a man who'd fought for justice when it wasn't popular, hanging in the air. Callahan's eyes flickered with recognition, then shame, as he realized who she was. The spectators whispered, the truth dawning, Maya wasn't just a victim, she was a federal agent, sent to expose the rot within this courtroom. Reed stepped back, his hand falling to his side, the memory of his own abuses now a shadow he couldn't escape. Emily's screen locked, a red warning flashing, all access attempts reported. She knew then that her role in this system, her complicity, was being documented too. Maya's silence had turned the courtroom into a mirror, reflecting not just their actions but the choices that led them here. The Fulton County Courthouse's No. 3 courtroom was no longer a place of quiet authority, it was a stage, and Maya Ellison had rewritten the script. Her live stream, activated by the silver emblem under her collar, had torn through the internet like wildfire, the viewer count soaring past 2 million in under an hour. Clips of Judge Robert Callahan's command to kneel, Officer Daniel Reed's sneering demands, and Maya's unyielding silence flooded social media, each share amplifying a collective outrage that had simmered for years. Sarah Nguyen, the 28-year-old journalist in the gallery, watched her post explode, her phone vibrating with notifications. Growing up in a Vietnamese-American neighborhood, she'd seen friends and family profiled, their dignity stripped by officers like Reed. Her mother's words, "Wait for the moment, then speak, echoed as she typed furiously, sharing links to the stream on every platform. Her followers, many from marginalized communities, added their own stories, wrongful stops, erased complaints, silenced voices. Maya's kneel became their rallying cry, a symbol of resistance that didn't need words to resonate. Outside the courthouse, the story spread like a shockwave. In Atlanta's coffee shops, offices, and homes, people watched the grainy footage of Maya kneeling, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. A young law student, Michael Torres, 22, saw the clip on his phone during a lecture break. His older brother had been wrongfully convicted years ago, a memory that drove Michael to law school. The sight of Maya's defiance stirred something deep, a mix of anger and hope. He shared the video with his study group, captioning it, "This is why we fight." Within hours, students across the country were organizing, demanding reviews of similar cases. Judge Callahan sat motionless, his hands no longer reaching for the gavel. The memory of Samuel Ellison, Maya's father, haunted him, a man who'd once forced him to face his own biases in a courtroom decades ago. Callahan had buried that shame under years of rulings, but Maya's words, "You haven't forgotten, have you?" unearthed it. His career, built on maintaining order, now faced a reckoning he couldn't control. The live stream exposed his nod, his command to kneel, as not just a mistake but a deliberate abuse of power. Officer Reed's bravado had crumbled. The viral footage showed his sneer, his boot crushing Maya's permit, and his hand on her shoulder. His father's influence couldn't shield him now. Memories of past incidents, complaints he'd dismissed, lives he'd disrupted, flooded back, each one a weight pulling him down. He glanced at the courtroom doors, half expecting federal agents to walk through, his career teetering on the edge of collapse. Emily Harris, the clerk, stared at her locked screen, the red warning, "All access attempts reported," a silent accusation. She thought of her daughter, for whom she'd justified every falsified record, every moment of compliance. But Maya's note, "I do not apologize for doing nothing wrong," mirrored Emily's own buried guilt. She'd chosen survival over integrity, and now that choice was laid bare, recorded for the world to see. On social media, hashtags like #KneelWithMaya trended, with thousands posting photos of themselves kneeling in public squares, classrooms, and workplaces, heads unbowed. A law professor in Boston tweeted, "Maya Ellison didn't speak, but her silence is teaching us what justice looks like." Michael Torres and his peers drafted petitions, demanding audits of Callahan's past rulings. Sarah's posts, now shared by millions, included a call to action: "If you've seen injustice, don't stay silent. Speak for Maya." In a quiet moment, Maya stood at the courtroom center, her presence a quiet storm. She didn't need to shout, her silence was enough to make the system tremble. As the live stream continued, a man in a gray suit entered, unnoticed by most but recognized by Maya as a federal contact. He carried a white envelope, a summons for Callahan, Reed, and Harris, signaling the start of an investigation that would unravel their world. Maya's heart beat steadily, her father's words echoing, "You decide how tall you stand." She had knelt, but she stood taller than anyone in the room. The Fulton County Courthouse, once a bastion of untouchable authority, now felt like a house of cards under the weight of Maya Ellison's silent defiance. The live stream, broadcasting every damning moment, had reached over 10 million viewers, its raw footage exposing Judge Robert Callahan's orders, Officer Daniel Reed's aggression, and Clerk Emily Harris's complicity. The nation watched, transfixed, as a single woman's kneel unraveled a system that had thrived on silence. A man in a gray suit stepped into the courtroom, his presence slicing through the tension like a blade. He was a federal agent, his white envelope containing summons from the United States Department of Justice. "Judge Robert Callahan, Officer Daniel Reed, and Clerk Emily Harris," he announced, his voice steady, emotionless, "you are under investigation for civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and concealment of wrongful prosecution." The words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding. The room froze, every eye on the trio, their faces pale, their power stripped bare. Callahan's hands trembled, his mind racing back to a moment 20 years ago when Samuel Ellison, Maya's father, had stood before him, exposing his misuse of judicial power. That defeat had been private, buried in case files. This was public, eternal, captured on a feed that couldn't be erased. Reed's bravado was gone, replaced by the memory of every complaint he'd dismissed, every life he'd disrupted, now replayed for millions. Emily's screen was locked, her past lies, altered records to protect her job, now evidence against her. She thought of her daughter, the reason she'd compromised, and felt a hollow ache. Senator James Carter, a 55-year-old African-American from Georgia, led the federal investigation. Carter had grown up in the civil rights era, his own father jailed for protesting segregation, a memory that fueled his career fighting systemic racism. He stood before a packed congressional hearing, the courtroom footage playing on a screen behind him. "You ordered a black woman to kneel," he said, his voice a deep rumble, addressing Callahan, Reed, and Harris. "Have you ever asked yourselves what you've bowed to?" The question hung, unanswered, as the footage replayed Callahan's nod, Reed's sneer, and Maya's unbowed gaze. Sarah Nguyen, now a viral figure for her posts, sat in the hearings gallery, her notebook filled with stories from others, people who'd been profiled, silenced, or erased. Her own past, the fear of police in her community, drove her to keep sharing, her posts now a platform for a movement. Michael Torres, the law student, organized protests outside, his brother's wrongful conviction a fire in his chest. He held a sign, "Maya knelt, we stand." Thousands joined him, their voices echoing Maya's silence. Maya herself stood at the hearing's edge, unnoticed, her silver emblem glinting faintly. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence was enough, a reminder of her father's lessons: truth doesn't need volume, just timing. The investigation revealed a culture of complicity, altered records, ignored complaints, and judges like Callahan who prioritized order over justice. Carter's committee uncovered files from Callahan's past, including a case Samuel Ellison had challenged, proving a pattern of abuse. The public's response grew louder. Social media overflowed with stories of injustice, each one a thread in the tapestry Maya had woven. A Denver police officer resigned, citing Maya's kneel as his wake-up call. Law schools, including Michael's, added her case to their curricula, calling it nonverbal resistance. Sarah's posts inspired a hashtag #StandWithMaya, trending globally as people shared their own moments of silence or defiance. In a quiet moment, Maya slipped away, her mission complete. She thought of her father, who died believing she'd carry his fight. The federal probe was just the beginning, the real change was in the millions who now questioned the system, their voices rising where hers had stayed silent. The courtroom, once a stage for her humiliation, was now a mirror, reflecting a nation forced to confront its own complicity. The fallout from Maya Ellison's kneel rippled far beyond the Fulton County Courthouse, reshaping the nation's conscience like a stone dropped in still water. The live stream, now viewed by over 20 million, had become a cultural touchstone, its images, Maya kneeling, Judge Callahan's nod, Officer Reed's sneer, etched into public memory. Social media platforms buzzed with #StandWithMaya, each post a story of personal injustice, each share a demand for change. The system, once a monolith, was cracking under the weight of a single woman's silence. Michael Torres, the 22-year-old law student, stood at the forefront of a growing movement. His brother's wrongful conviction, a wound that never healed, drove him to organize petitions demanding audits of Callahan's rulings. Michael's study group, once focused on passing exams, now met in coffee shops, drafting letters to senators and planning rallies. His brother's voice, hoarse from years in prison, echoed in Michael's mind, "Don't let them bury the truth." Maya's kneel gave Michael the courage to dig, his petitions gaining thousands of signatures daily. Sarah Nguyen's role as a journalist had transformed. Her posts, initially a spontaneous act of defiance, were now a platform for millions. She shared stories from followers, a mother stopped for suspicious behavior, a teenager detained without cause, each one mirroring her own experiences in a marginalized community. Sarah's apartment, cluttered with notebooks and empty coffee cups, became a hub for activists. She interviewed Michael, broadcasting his story to her growing audience, her voice trembling with the weight of her own past, a childhood where police lights meant fear, not safety. Judge Callahan, once untouchable, sat alone in his chambers, the federal summons burning a hole in his desk. The memory of Samuel Ellison, Maya's father, haunted him, a man who'd challenged his rulings and won. Callahan had spent decades burying that defeat, but Maya's words, "You haven't forgotten, have you?" unearthed it. His career, built on control, was unraveling, his name now synonymous with abuse. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the man who'd let power blind him to justice. Officer Reed faced his own reckoning. The viral footage exposed his actions, and his father's influence couldn't save him now. Complaints he'd buried, young men stopped, families intimidated, resurfaced, each one a nail in his career's coffin. Reed's nights were sleepless, haunted by the faces of those he'd wronged, Maya's unbowed gaze the sharpest among them. His resignation loomed, not as a choice but as an inevitability, the system no longer shielding its own. Emily Harris, the clerk, grappled with her complicity. The red warning on her screen, "All access attempts reported," was a verdict on her past. She'd falsified records to secure her daughter's future, but Maya's note, "I do not apologize for doing nothing wrong," forced Emily to confront the cost. She wrote a letter to her daughter, confessing her choices, hoping to teach her what Maya had taught the world: silence can be complicity, but it can also be courage. Across the country, Maya's silence sparked action. In Boston, a law professor revised his syllabus, adding "the Ellison case" as a study in nonverbal resistance. In Denver, a police officer resigned publicly, citing Maya's kneel as his turning point. In Atlanta, Michael's petition led to the reopening of 3 cases, including his brother's, each one revealing patterns of abuse linked to Callahan's court. Sarah's platform grew, her followers now a community of voices demanding accountability. Maya, in hiding, read the news on a burner phone, her heart heavy but resolute. She thought of her father, who died believing she'd carry his fight. His words, "You decide how tall you stand," were her guide, her silence a deliberate choice to let the system face itself. The ripples of her kneel were reshaping courtrooms, classrooms, and consciences, proving that one woman's silence could speak louder than 1,000 gavels. The echo of Maya Ellison's kneel reverberated through the halls of America's law schools, turning lecture rooms into battlegrounds of conscience. At Emory University in Atlanta, a first-year lecture hall buzzed with tension, the air thick with unspoken questions. Professor Laura Bennett, a 50-year-old constitutional law expert, stood before her students, her usual confidence shaken. She'd once defended Judge Robert Callahan's rulings as procedural necessity, but Maya's case had exposed those procedures as tools of oppression. Now, her students demanded answers, their laptops open not to notes but to petitions and viral clips of Maya's silence. Michael Torres sat in the front row, his eyes sharp, his notebook filled with quotes from Maya's hearing. His brother's wrongful conviction, overturned after Maya's case prompted a review, had transformed Michael from a quiet student to a vocal advocate. He raised his hand, his voice steady. "If the system is wrong, why do we study it as if it's right?" The question, simple but piercing, silenced the room. Bennett's gaze faltered, her own past, defending flawed rulings to secure tenure, now a shadow she couldn't escape. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded. In Boston, a law professor added "the Ellison case" to his syllabus, calling it a study in deliberate silence. Students at Yale launched a petition to remove Callahan's name from textbooks, citing his abuse of power. At Stanford, a freshman posted Maya's image, kneeling, head unbowed, on the school's internal forum, captioned, "This is the law we should learn." The post garnered thousands of shares, each one a call to rethink justice. Sarah Nguyen's platform grew, her apartment now a makeshift newsroom. She interviewed students like Michael, sharing their stories of personal reckonings. Her own past, being profiled as a teenager, her family's fear of authority, fueled her work. She posted a clip of a Denver officer's resignation, inspired by Maya, with a caption, "Silence can break systems." Her followers, now in the millions, shared stories of their own silences, their own moments of complicity or courage. In Atlanta, Officer Daniel Reed's resignation was announced quietly, buried in a local news brief. His father's influence couldn't shield him from the public's wrath, the viral footage of his actions a permanent stain. Reed's nights were haunted by memories of those he'd wronged, their faces blending with Maya's unyielding gaze. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the man who'd let power define him. Emily Harris, the clerk, submitted her resignation, her letter confessing her role in falsifying records. She wrote to her daughter, explaining her choices and urging her to learn from Maya's courage. "I stayed silent to protect you," she wrote, "but silence can hurt more than it helps." Emily's departure was a small act, but it rippled, inspiring other clerks to review their own records, uncovering more abuses linked to Callahan's court. Judge Callahan faced a federal inquiry, his career unraveling. The memory of Samuel Ellison, Maya's father, loomed large, a man who'd challenged him and won. Callahan's arrogance, once his shield, was now his downfall, his name struck from legal journals. He sat alone, the summons on his desk a reminder of his failure to see justice beyond power. Maya, in hiding, read about the changes on her burner phone. She thought of her father's sacrifices, his late-night talks about fighting for those who couldn't. Her silence wasn't retreat but strategy, letting the system confront its own flaws. In classrooms, her name became a verb, to Ellison, meaning to resist without speaking. The revolution she'd sparked wasn't loud, but it was deep, reshaping how a generation saw the law and their place within it. Maya Ellison's absence was as powerful as her presence. She'd vanished from public view, her burner phone her only link to the world she'd upended. No interviews, no speeches, no social media, yet her silence spoke louder than any platform. In Atlanta, the Fulton County Courthouse stood quieter now, its halls echoing with the aftermath of her kneel. The nation, still reeling from the viral footage, grappled with a truth it couldn't ignore: one woman's silence had forced a system to face its own reflection. Michael Torres led a student movement that spread beyond Emory University. His brother's exoneration, a direct result of Maya's case, gave him purpose. He organized forums where students shared stories of injustice, each one a thread in the tapestry Maya had woven. Michael's own pain, watching his brother disappear into the system, fueled his resolve. He posted a manifesto online: "Maya knelt so we could stand. Let's not sit again." The post, shared millions of times, inspired petitions that reopened dozens of cases nationwide, each one revealing patterns of abuse tied to judges like Robert Callahan. Sarah Nguyen's apartment was now a nerve center for activists. Her posts, once personal outbursts, were now a beacon for those silenced by power. She shared a story from a follower, a black mother detained for suspicious behavior while picking up her child. The story mirrored Sarah's own, her childhood fear of police lights resurfacing. She interviewed Michael, broadcasting his manifesto, her voice steady but her heart heavy with the weight of her community's pain. Her hashtag #StandWithMaya, became a global call, uniting voices from Harlem to Tokyo. Judge Callahan's fall was complete. The federal inquiry stripped him of his title, his name erased from legal textbooks. He sat in his empty chambers, haunted by Samuel Ellison's challenge decades ago and Maya's words now: "You haven't forgotten, have you?" His career, built on control, had crumbled under the weight of a single gaze. He wrote a resignation letter, not out of remorse but necessity, his hands shaking as he realized he'd become a cautionary tale. Officer Daniel Reed's life unraveled in parallel. His resignation was ignored by a public that saw him as a symbol of abuse. He moved to a small town, hoping to escape, but the viral footage followed, replayed in bars and on social media. Memories of his past actions, families intimidated, complaints buried, kept him awake, Maya's unbowed eyes a constant shadow. He tried to write an apology, but the words felt hollow, a reflection of a man who'd lost his way. Emily Harris found redemption in confession. After resigning, she volunteered with a legal aid group, reviewing cases like those Maya's Neil had exposed. She wrote to her daughter daily, sharing lessons learned too late: courage isn't loud, it's choosing to act when silence is easier. Her work uncovered more falsified records, each one a step toward atonement, a way to honor the woman who'd shown her the cost of complicity. In law schools, Maya's name was no longer just a case study, it was a criterion. Professors revised curricula, adding the Ellison case as a lens for examining systemic bias. Students debated her silence, some calling it emotional, others calling it strategic. A UCLA professor concluded a lecture with, "Maya didn't speak, but she made us listen." The room nodded, not in agreement but in recognition of a truth they couldn't ignore. Maya, in a small library far from Atlanta, sat with her father's old notebook, its pages yellowed but his words clear: "There is no justice, only my daughter." She wrote a new line: "Silence is a mirror, let them look." Her absence wasn't hiding, it was a choice, letting the system and society confront their reflections. Her Neil had become a mirror, showing not just the flaws of a courtroom but the courage it takes to stand tall by kneeling. Maya Ellison's Neil had done more than crack a courtroom, it had fractured a nation's complacency. Months after the Fulton County Courthouse hearing, her name was no longer just a headline, it was a verb, a challenge, a mirror held up to every corner of society. Law schools taught the Ellison case as a cornerstone of nonverbal resistance, its black and white image, Maya kneeling, eyes unbowed, pinned to bulletin boards from Atlanta to Seattle. The system, once a fortress, was now a construction site, rebuilding under the scrutiny of millions. Michael Torres stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional panel on judicial reform. His brother's exoneration had been the first of many, with dozens of cases reopened thanks to his petitions. Michael, now 23, spoke with a fire born from loss. Maya Ellison knelt so we could stand. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was a demand for us to speak. His words, broadcast live, inspired thousands to join the movement, their stories of injustice flooding social media, each one a brick in the wall Maya had begun to build. Sarah Nguyen's platform had grown into a global network, her apartment now a studio where she recorded interviews with activists, victims, and reformed officials. Her own past, fear of authority, the sting of being profiled, gave her voice authenticity. She shared a story from a Chicago teacher who'd knelt in her classroom, head unbowed, to honor Maya and teach her students about courage. Sarah's hashtag #StandWithMaya, was now a symbol, painted on murals, printed on shirts, whispered in protests. Judge Robert Callahan's name was erased from history, his rulings struck from textbooks, his legacy a cautionary tale. He lived in obscurity, haunted by Samuel Ellison's challenge and Maya's gaze, unable to escape the mirror of his own actions. Officer Daniel Reed faded into a small town, his resignation a footnote, his past abuses a shadow he couldn't outrun. Emily Harris found purpose in legal aid, her confessions to her daughter a daily reminder to choose courage over complicity. In a quiet library, Maya sat alone, her father's notebook open before her. She wrote, "I knelt not to bow, but to show them they could fall." Her silence had been her weapon, letting the system expose its own flaws. She'd vanished from the public eye, not to hide but to let her absence amplify the voices she'd awakened. Her father's words, "There is no justice, only my daughter," were her guide, a reminder that her fight was for those who'd been silenced, not for fame. The system began to change, not with fanfare but with quiet accountability. 14 states halted judicial processes to review verdicts, prompted by Maya's case. Law schools rewrote curricula, emphasizing ethics over procedure. A Denver officer's resignation inspired others, each citing Maya's Neil as their turning point. Michael's movement led to new laws, protecting against wrongful prosecutions. Sarah's platform became a hub for reform, her stories a call to action. Maya's final act was a note, left in a library book: choose silence over submission, but never bow. It was found by a student, shared online, and became a mantra, a reminder that justice lives not in gavels but in the courage to stand tall, even when kneeling. To everyone who's followed Maya's journey, thank you. You've walked with her through injustice, resistance, and triumph, feeling the weight of her silence and the power of her stand. If her story stirred something in you, share it. Post your own experiences of injustice, big or small, and let's build a community where silence becomes strength. Like, share, and subscribe to Revenge Ties, not for numbers, but to keep telling stories that remind us we're not alone. Every comment you leave, every story you share, is a step toward a world where no one is forced to kneel. Thank you for standing with us, for listening, and for believing that justice starts when we choose to see.